Were the Vikings black? A journey through time with quiet historian. Close your eyes for a moment, and let me take you somewhere far from the glow of screens and the hum of modern life. Picture yourself standing on a rocky shore in what we now call Norway, perhaps 1,000 years ago, as the first pale light of dawn touches the waters of a fjord. The air is crisp, carrying the salt tang of the sea and the earthy scent of pine forests that climb the steep valley walls like dark green tapestries. Before you, carved dragon heads rise from the mist like ancient spirits. Longships rest at anchor, their hulls dark against the silver water, their sails furled after journeys that might have taken them to the green shores of Ireland, the trading posts of Kiev, or even the golden markets of Constantinople. The gentle lap of waves against their wooden sides creates a rhythm as old as the tides themselves. This is the world of the Vikings. Not the world of Hollywood fantasies or modern reimaginings, but the real world of farmers and traders, warriors and craftsmen, mothers and children who lived and died beneath these northern skies. It's a world that has captured our imagination for centuries, and perhaps never more so than today, when questions about identity and belonging seem to echo across every conversation. But who were these people really? What did they look like as they pulled their oars through icy waters or gathered around fires in their longhouses? What stories did their faces tell? And what truths lie buried in the earth alongside their bones and belongings? These questions matter more than you might think. In our time, when the past seems to shift like sand beneath our feet, when artificial intelligence can conjure images that never existed, and social media can spread stories faster than wildfire, the truth about the Vikings has become a battleground for modern ideas about race, culture, and belonging. You've perhaps seen the images. AI-generated pictures of black Vikings. Claims that the longships were crewed predominantly by African warriors. Suggestions that everything we thought we knew about Norse culture was wrong. These images spread across social media with the speed of a summer storm across the fjords, shared by people who may genuinely believe they're correcting historical injustices or revealing hidden truths. But here's what troubles me. Speaking to you now in the quiet hours when truth feels more precious than gold. When we distort the past to serve present purposes, we lose something irreplaceable. We lose the actual human beings who lived these lives, who faced their own struggles and joys under these same stars. We lose the complexity of real history in favor of simple stories that fit our modern needs. The Vikings were not cartoon characters or political symbols. They were people. Complex, contradictory, fully human people who lived in a specific time and place. Some had hair as black as a raven's wing, earning them nicknames that echo through the sagas. Others bore the genetic traces of marriages that crossed tribal boundaries, of trade relationships that spanned continents, of the slow mixing that happens when cultures meet at the edges of the known world. They were, in their own way, multicultural, but not in the way we might imagine today. Their diversity came from the interweaving of Scandinavian, Celtic, Slavic, and Finnic peoples, from marriages that sealed alliances and trade relationships that brought distant goods to northern markets. It was the diversity of a world where your neighbor might have been born in what we now call Denmark, while your wife came from the islands we now call Scotland. Tonight, as we journey together through their world, I want to show you the real Vikings, not the ones invented by modern politics or artificial intelligence, but the ones who left their bones in Scandinavian soil, their DNA in modern populations, their stories in ancient sagas, and their artifacts in archaeological sites from Greenland to the Black Sea. We'll walk together through their villages, where the smoke of cooking fires mixed with the sound of children playing and the ring of hammers on iron. We'll sail with them on their journeys, feeling the spray of cold water and hearing the creak of wooden hulls. We'll sit in their longhouses as winter winds howl outside, listening to the stories they told about heroes and gods, about distant lands and strange peoples they had encountered. Most importantly, we'll try to see them as they saw themselves, not through the lens of our modern concerns about race and representation, but as members of families and communities, as followers of particular gods and keepers of particular traditions, as people who understood themselves in ways that don't always translate neatly into our contemporary categories. This isn't a story about politics, though politics will inevitably intrude. It's not a story about what we want the past to have been, but about what it actually was. It's a story about human beings who lived and loved and died in a world very different from ours, yet who shared with us the fundamental experiences of being human, the need for belonging, the desire for adventure, the love of family, the fear of the unknown. As we begin this journey together, I ask only that you listen with an open heart and a curious mind. Let the gentle rhythm of waves against longship hulls carry you into their world. Feel the warmth of their fires and the chill of their winters. Hear their voices speaking across the centuries, not in the simplified slogans of modern debate, but in all their human complexity. The truth about the Vikings is more beautiful and more complicated than any political narrative could capture. It's a truth written in ancient DNA and carved in stone, preserved in sagas and buried in graves, carried in the very landscape of Scandinavia itself. It's a truth that honors both the people they actually were and the world they actually inhabited. So, come with me now, as the mist rises from the fjords and the first light of dawn touches the dragon heads of their ships. Let's discover together who the Vikings really were. Not the Vikings of our imagination or our politics, but the Vikings of history, in all their flawed and fascinating humanity. The water is still, the morning is quiet, and the stories are waiting to be told. The world of the Vikings. The longhouse stands before us in the pale morning light, its timber walls dark with age and weather, its turf roof green with grass and wildflowers that nod in the gentle breeze. Smoke rises from the central hearth, carrying with it the sense of cooking porridge and the everyday life of a Viking Age family. This is where our journey truly begins. Not with the dramatic raids and distant voyages that fill the history books, but with the quiet rhythms of daily life in medieval Scandinavia. Step with me across the threshold, your eyes adjusting to the dim interior lit by the glow of the central fire. The air is thick with smoke that finds its way out through gaps in the roof, and the earthen floor is packed hard by generations of feet. Along the walls, raised platforms serve as beds and benches, covered with furs and woolen blankets dyed in the deep reds and blues that Viking women coaxed from local plants and imported materials. Here, in this smoky, intimate space, lived the people we call Vikings, though they would never have used that word to describe themselves. They were Norwegians, Danes, Swedes, people of specific regions and specific loyalties, bound together by language and custom, but divided by the fierce tribal politics that characterized their age. The word Viking itself referred not to a people but to an activity, the act of going raiding or trading, of taking to the sea in search of wealth and adventure. But what did these people actually look like? This question, so simple on its surface, has become tangled in modern debates about race and representation. Let me show you what the evidence actually tells us, written in bones and DNA, in grave goods and ancient descriptions. The woman stirring the porridge pot before us would likely have been fair-skinned, her hair ranging from the pale blonde we associate with Scandinavia to darker shades of brown or even black. Her husband, perhaps sharpening a knife by the fire, might have had the reddish hair that appears frequently in the genetic record of medieval Scandinavia, or the dark hair that earned some Vikings nicknames like the Black, referring not to their skin color, but to the unusual darkness of their hair in a population where lighter shades were more common. Archaeological evidence from thousands of Viking-age graves tells us a consistent story. The skulls and bones recovered from burial sites across Scandinavia show predominantly Northern European features. The high cheekbones, the robust build, the bone structure we associate with Germanic and Nordic populations. Isotope analysis of their teeth, which can reveal where a person spent their childhood, confirms that the vast majority of people buried in Viking-age Scandinavia were born and raised in that region. But this doesn't mean their world was uniform or isolated. DNA analysis of Viking-age remains reveals a population that was, in its own way, remarkably diverse. The diversity, however, was not what modern observers might expect. It was the diversity of a region where Scandinavian populations mixed with Celtic peoples from the British Isles, with Slavic peoples from the east, with Finnic peoples from the north, and occasionally, very occasionally, with individuals from even more distant lands. Consider the family before us in this longhouse. The woman's grandmother might have been captured in a raid on the Irish coast, her Celtic features gradually blending into the local population. The man's great-grandfather could have been a trader from what we now call Russia, his Slavic heritage adding another thread to the complex tapestry of Northern European genetics. Their children would carry all these influences, yet they would still be recognizably Scandinavian, still part of the cultural and genetic continuum that stretched across the northern regions of Europe. This mixing happened gradually, over generations, through the normal processes of trade, intermarriage, and cultural exchange that characterize all human societies. It was not the result of massive population movements or dramatic demographic changes, but of the slow, steady interweaving that occurs when peoples live in proximity and interact regularly. The physical appearance of Vikings, then, was varied, but within a recognizable range. They were taller than many of their European contemporaries. Grave excavations suggest average heights of around 5'7" for men and 5'2" for women. Impressive for the medieval period. They were generally robust and well-muscled, the result of lives spent in physical labor and, for some, in warfare. Their clothing, woven from wool and linen, was often richly decorated with intricate patterns and dyed in vibrant colors that spoke to their love of beauty and display. But to understand who the Vikings were, we must look beyond physical appearance to the world that shaped them. This was a world of small communities scattered across a harsh but beautiful landscape, where survival depended on cooperation and kinship ties. The longhouse we're visiting might shelter 20 or 30 people, not just the nuclear family of parents and children, but grandparents, unmarried siblings, servants, and perhaps a few slaves captured in distant raids. The rhythm of life here followed the seasons with an intensity we can barely imagine in our climate-controlled modern world. summer was a time of frantic activity, planting and tending crops, cutting and storing hay, preparing for the long winter ahead. It was also the season for voyages, when the ice-free seas allowed for trading expeditions and raids that might take men away from home for months at a time. Winter brought a different rhythm, one of indoor crafts and storytelling, of maintaining equipment and planning for the year ahead. The long, dark months were lit by oil lamps and the central fire, filled with the sounds of looms and the voices of skalds reciting the ancient stories that preserved their history and values. These were not primitive people living in crude conditions. Archaeological evidence reveals a sophisticated material culture, with skilled metalworking, intricate wood carving, and textile production that rivaled anything found elsewhere in medieval Europe. Their ships, the famous longships that carried them across the known world, were marvels of engineering, shallow-drafted vessels that could navigate both open seas and shallow rivers, fast enough to outrun pursuit and sturdy enough to survive Atlantic storms. The social structure of Viking society was complex and hierarchical, but with more mobility than many medieval societies offered. At the top were the jarls, the aristocratic class who owned large estates and commanded loyalty from lesser men. Below them were the carls, free farmers and craftsmen who formed the backbone of society. At the bottom were the thralls, slaves captured in raids or born into bondage, who performed much of the heavy labor that kept the economy functioning. But even within this hierarchy, there was room for advancement. A successful warrior might earn enough wealth to buy land and rise in status. A skilled craftsman could accumulate enough resources to become a trader. A clever slave might earn or buy freedom and begin the slow climb up the social ladder. This mobility, combined with the opportunities offered by raiding and trading, created a dynamic society where individual achievement could overcome the circumstances of birth. The religious life of the Vikings was equally complex, blending the worship of gods like Odin, Thor, and Freyr with deep reverence for ancestors and local spirits. Their cosmology was rich and sophisticated, encompassing multiple worlds connected by the great tree Yggdrasil, populated by gods and giants, heroes and monsters. This was not a simple or primitive belief system, but a complex mythology that provided meaning and structure to their understanding of the world. As we sit by the fire in this longhouse, listening to the crackle of burning wood and the murmur of conversation, we can begin to understand how these people saw themselves. They were not defined primarily by what we would call race, but by kinship, by loyalty to specific leaders, by membership in particular communities. A man's identity came from his family line, his reputation for courage and honor, his skill as a warrior or craftsman or trader. The concept of whiteness or blackness, as we understand it today, would have been largely meaningless to them. What mattered was whether you were kin or stranger, friend or enemy, free or slave. A Celtic woman married into a Norwegian family would become Norwegian through marriage and adoption of local customs. A Slavic trader who settled in Denmark and adopted Danish ways would be accepted as Danish, regardless of his origins. This doesn't mean they were colorblind or unaware of physical differences. The sagas are full of descriptions of people's appearance, often noting unusual features that set individuals apart from the norm. But these differences were seen as individual characteristics, not as markers of fundamental racial categories that determined a person's worth or place in society. The diversity that existed in Viking society was real but limited. DNA evidence suggests that while there was mixing with neighboring populations, the core of Viking Age Scandinavia remained genetically Scandinavian. The occasional individual from more distant lands, perhaps a trader from the Byzantine Empire or a slave from North Africa, would have been notable precisely because of their rarity. These encounters with distant peoples were part of what made Viking culture so dynamic and adaptable. Through their far-flung trading networks, they encountered Slavs and Byzantines, Arabs and Franks, Celts and Anglo-Saxons. They adopted useful technologies, incorporated new artistic styles, and sometimes brought home wives and slaves from distant lands. But these influences were absorbed into a fundamentally Scandinavian cultural matrix, adding complexity and richness without fundamentally altering the basic character of the society. As the fire burns low and the evening draws in around our longhouse, we can see the Vikings beginning to emerge not as the simplified figures of modern imagination, but as complex human beings living in a complex world. They were shaped by their harsh northern environment, by their warrior culture, by their sophisticated understanding of seamanship and trade. They were capable of both great cruelty and great beauty, of both fierce loyalty and bitter betrayal. Most importantly, they were people of their time and place, not symbols or representatives of modern political positions. They lived according to the values and understanding of medieval Scandinavia, not according to contemporary ideas about diversity and representation. To understand them truly, we must see them in their own context, judged by their own standards, appreciated for what they actually were, rather than what we might wish them to have been. The woman by the fire looks up as we prepare to leave, her eyes reflecting the flames, her face bearing the weathered beauty of a life lived close to the elements. In her features, we might see traces of Celtic ancestry, perhaps Slavic influences, certainly the fundamental Nordic characteristics that defined her people. But more than any physical traits, we see in her face the strength and dignity of someone who lived fully in her own time, who faced the challenges of her world with courage and grace. This is the truth about Viking appearance and identity. Not simple, not easily categorized, but rich with the complexity of real human experience. They were neither the pure Nordic archetypes of some fantasies, nor the diverse multicultural society of others. They were something more interesting and more human, a people shaped by their environment and their history, carrying within themselves the genetic and cultural heritage of Northern Europe, touched by contact with distant lands, but rooted firmly in the soil of Scandinavia, beneath fur and iron, beneath the legends and the politics. They were still men and women of the North, children of a harsh and beautiful land that shaped their bodies and their souls in ways that echo still in the faces of their descendants and in the stories that have survived the centuries. Names, sagas, and colors. The skald's voice carries across the longhouse like smoke from the central fire, weaving words into patterns as intricate as the metalwork on a warrior's sword hilt. Tonight, he tells the story of Halfdan Svarte, Halfdan the Black, a king who ruled in eastern Norway in the 9th century, whose very name has become a point of contention in our modern debates about Viking identity. Listen carefully to the rhythm of the Old Norse as it would have sounded in that smoky hall. Halfdan Svarte Konungur. The words roll off the tongue like waves against a ship's hull, carrying with them not just the story of one man, but the entire worldview of a people who understood names as repositories of power, memory, and meaning. But what did it mean to be called the Black in Viking Age Scandinavia? This question takes us deep into the heart of how these people understood identity, appearance, and the power of language itself. To answer it properly, we must become archaeologists of meaning, digging through layers of linguistic evolution and cultural assumption to uncover the truth that lies buried beneath centuries of interpretation. Halfdan Svarta lived in the 9th century, a time when Norway was not yet a unified kingdom, but a patchwork of petty kingdoms and competing chieftains. He ruled from Vestfold, in what is now southeastern Norway, and his story comes to us through the sagas, those remarkable works of medieval literature that blend history, legend, and cultural memory into narratives that have shaped our understanding of the Viking world. The sagas tell us that Halfdan was called Svarta because of his hair. Hair so black it was remarkable in a population where lighter shades were more common. This was not a reference to his skin color, as some modern interpreters have suggested, but to the unusual darkness of his hair, which set him apart from his contemporaries and earned him a nickname that would echo through history. To understand why this matters, we need to step into the mental world of medieval Scandinavia, where nicknames were not casual additions to a person's identity, but crucial markers that distinguished individuals in a society where many people shared the same given names. In a world where every other man might be named Olaf or Eric, nicknames became essential identifiers, often based on the most distinctive physical or personality traits. These nicknames could be flattering or insulting, based on appearance or behavior, temporary or permanent. A man might be called the tall, or the short, the wise, or the foolish, the red for his hair or beard, or the white for premature graying. The key point is that these names described what made a person distinctive within their community, not what made them typical. Halfdan's black hair was notable precisely because it was uncommon. In a population where blonde, brown, and red hair were the norm, truly black hair would have been striking enough to become a permanent part of his identity. The sagas describe him as handsome and well-formed, a successful king who expanded his territory and left behind a son who would become even more famous, Harald Fairhair, the first king to unite Norway under a single crown. But Halfdan Svarta is not the only figure from the sagas whose name has been misinterpreted in modern discussions of Viking diversity. Even more controversial is the case of Geirmund Heljarskin, an Icelandic settler whose very name seems to suggest African ancestry to those who approach the sagas with modern assumptions about race and identity. Let us travel now from the royal halls of 9th century Norway to the wind-swept shores of Iceland, where Geirmund made his home in the late 9th or early 10th century. Iceland, in this period, was a frontier society, settled by Norwegian emigrants who brought with them not just their possessions and livestock, but their stories, their laws, and their complex understanding of identity and belonging. Geirmund's nickname, Heljarskin, literally translates as hellskin or deathskin, and it's easy to see how modern interpreters might read this as black-skinned. But to understand what the name actually meant, we need to delve deeper into Old Norse language and mythology, where words carried layers of meaning that don't always translate neatly into modern categories. The first element of the name, Hel, refers to the Norse goddess of death, who ruled over the realm of the dead that bore her name. In Norse mythology, Hel was described as half-living and half-dead, her body divided between the appearance of life and death. The second element, skin, means skin or hide, but in compound names like this it often carried metaphorical rather than literal meaning. So, heljarskin might indeed mean black-skinned, but it could equally mean death-pale or corpse-like in appearance. The name suggests someone whose complexion was so unusual, either remarkably dark or remarkably pale, that it reminded observers of death itself. Given the Norse tendency toward poetic metaphor and their complex relationship with death and the afterlife, either interpretation is plausible. The sagas provide additional context that helps us understand Geirmund's actual ancestry. He is described as the son of a Norwegian merchant and a Samoyed woman, the Samoyeds being a Finno-Ugric people from northern Russia and Siberia. This mixed heritage would indeed have given him an appearance that stood out in medieval Scandinavia, but not necessarily the African features that some modern interpreters have suggested. People of Samoyed ancestry typically have what we might call East Asian features, darker hair and eyes than the Scandinavian norm, perhaps a different bone structure, possibly a more olive or sallow complexion. In the context of medieval Norway, such features would certainly have been distinctive enough to earn a nickname, but they wouldn't have made Geirmund Black in the way we understand that term today. The complexity of interpreting these names reflects a broader challenge in understanding how medieval Scandinavians categorized and described human diversity. Their vocabulary for describing appearance was rich and nuanced, but it operated according to different principles than our modern racial categories. They were more likely to notice and comment on unusual features within their own population than to develop systematic ways of categorizing different ethnic groups. This becomes clear when we examine other nicknames from the sagas that describe physical appearance. We find the white, the red, the fair, the dark, the tall, the short, the stout, and dozens of others. These names tell us that Vikings were keenly observant of physical differences, but they approached these differences as individual characteristics rather than as markers of racial identity. The case of Eric the Red, the famous explorer who founded the first Norse settlement in Greenland, illustrates this point perfectly. His nickname clearly referred to his red hair or beard, a feature that was distinctive enough to become his primary identifier. But red hair, while less common than brown or blonde, was still well within the normal range of Scandinavian appearance. The fact that it earned him a permanent nickname shows how finely tuned Viking society was to individual physical variations. Similarly, we find references to the fair or the white, nicknames that might refer to particularly light hair or pale skin, again suggesting variations within the normal Scandinavian range rather than encounters with fundamentally different ethnic groups. When the sagas do describe encounters with people from distant lands, they tend to be much more explicit about their foreign origins and distinctive features. The linguistic evidence from Old Norse also reveals how Vikings understood and categorized human diversity. The language had specific terms for different ethnic groups: Irar for Irish, Vindir for Slavs, Blamen for dark-skinned people, literally blue men, possibly referring to sub-Saharan Africans or dark-skinned Arabs, and many others. When the sagas wanted to indicate that someone was from a different ethnic group, they had the vocabulary to do so clearly and explicitly. The fact that Halfdan is called simply the Black, rather than being identified with a specific ethnic term, suggests that his nickname referred to a variation within the normal Scandinavian range, rather than to foreign ancestry. If he had been of African or Arab descent, the sagas would likely have been much more explicit about his origins, as they were with other figures who came from distant lands. This pattern holds true across the vast corpus of saga literature. When foreign ancestry is relevant to a story, it's usually mentioned explicitly. We read of Irish princesses married to Norwegian kings, of Byzantine merchants trading in Scandinavian markets, of Slavic slaves working on Icelandic farms. The sagas don't shy away from describing ethnic diversity when it's present. They simply don't see it where modern interpreters sometimes want to find it. But the misinterpretation of these names reflects more than just linguistic confusion. It reveals the extent to which modern political concerns can distort our reading of historical sources. When we approach the sagas looking for evidence of racial diversity as we understand it today, we risk missing the actual diversity that existed in Viking society. A diversity based on regional, cultural, and linguistic differences rather than on racial categories. The real diversity of Viking society was complex and fascinating, but it operated according to different principles than modern multiculturalism. A Norwegian might marry a Danish woman, and their children would inherit cultural traditions from both regions. A Swedish trader might settle in Ireland and adopt Irish customs while maintaining his Scandinavian identity. A Slavic slave might earn freedom and become integrated into Scandinavian society, his children fully accepted as members of their local community. This kind of cultural mixing created a society that was diverse, but in ways that don't always map neatly onto modern categories. The Vikings were cosmopolitan in their outlook, widely traveled, and open to adopting useful innovations from other cultures. But this cosmopolitanism was built on a foundation of shared Scandinavian culture and identity that remained remarkably consistent across the Viking world. The names and nicknames preserved in the sagas offer us a window into this world, but only if we read them with careful attention to their original context and meaning. When we impose modern assumptions about race and identity onto medieval sources, we risk losing the actual complexity and richness of Viking society in favor of simplified narratives that serve contemporary political purposes. As we sit by the fire, listening to the skald's voice weave these ancient names into stories, we can begin to appreciate the sophistication of Viking naming practices and the worldview they reflect. These were people who paid close attention to individual differences, who valued distinctive characteristics, and who understood identity as something complex and multifaceted. Halfdan the Black earned his nickname not because he represented some hidden African presence in medieval Norway, but because his dark hair made him memorable in a world where such features were uncommon. Geirmund Heljarskin bore a name that reflected his unusual appearance, whether pale as death or dark as the underworld, in a society that noticed and remembered such distinctions. These names carry stories, but not always the stories that modern interpreters want to hear. They tell us about a society that was observant, poetic, and deeply interested in individual character and appearance. They reveal a people who understood diversity in their own terms, according to their own categories and values. The truth preserved in these ancient names is more subtle and more interesting than simple racial categories can capture. It's the truth of a society that was both homogeneous and diverse, both insular and cosmopolitan, both traditional and innovative. It's the truth of people who lived fully in their own time and place, who understood themselves according to their own logic and values. As the skald's voice fades and the fire burns low, we're left with the echo of these ancient names and the stories they carry. In them, we can hear not the simplified narratives of modern politics, but the complex, nuanced, fully human voices of people who lived and died 1,000 years ago, whose names have survived the centuries not as symbols or representatives, but as reminders of individual human beings who once walked this earth and left their mark on history. Names carried stories, not always skin, and in those stories lies a truth more precious than any modern interpretation could provide. Trade and contact. The morning mist clings to the river like the breath of sleeping giants as our longship glides silently through waters that have carried Viking traders for generations. We are following the ancient route that connected the fjords of Norway to the great trading centers of the medieval world. A network of rivers and seas that stretched from the ice-bound shores of Greenland to the sun-baked markets of Baghdad, from the Celtic monasteries of Ireland to the golden domes of Constantinople. This is where the story of Viking diversity truly begins to unfold. Not in the longhouses of Scandinavia, but on the trade routes that carried Norse merchants, warriors, and adventurers to the farthest corners of the known world. Here, in the cosmopolitan ports and river towns that dotted these ancient highways, Vikings encountered peoples and cultures that would leave their mark on Scandinavian society for generations to come. Feel the rhythm of the oars as they cut through the dark water, carrying us eastward along the Volga River toward the great trading city of Bulgar. This route, known to the Vikings as the Road to the Greeks, was one of the most important commercial arteries of the medieval world, connecting the fur-rich forests of Scandinavia with the silk and spice markets of the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world beyond. Our ship is heavy with cargo: bales of walrus ivory from Greenland, amber from the Baltic shores, furs from the northern forests, and iron from the Swedish mines. These goods, products of the harsh northern environment, were highly prized in the warmer lands to the south, where they commanded prices that could make a successful trader wealthy beyond the dreams of his farming ancestors. But we carry more than trade goods on this journey. We carry the cultural DNA of Scandinavia itself, ready to be mixed and modified through contact with the diverse peoples we will encounter along the way. And we will return home carrying not just silver and silk, but new ideas, new technologies, new stories, and sometimes new people who will become part of the ever-evolving tapestry of Viking society. The first major stop on our journey is Novgorod, the great trading city that the Vikings called Holmgard. Here, in the smoky markets and crowded warehouses, we encounter our first taste of the diversity that characterized the medieval trade networks. Slavic merchants haggle with Scandinavian traders, their languages blending into a commercial pidgin that facilitates business across cultural boundaries. The Slavs we meet here are not so different from the Scandinavians in basic appearance. Fair-skinned, often blonde or brown-haired, with the robust build of Northern Europeans. But their cultural traditions, their language, their religious practices, and their social organization are distinct enough to make them clearly foreign to our Viking traders. Some of these Slavs will eventually make their way north to Scandinavia, either as traders, as wives, or as slaves, adding their genetic and cultural contributions to the Scandinavian mix. Archaeological evidence from Novgorod and other trading centers along this route reveals the extent of this cultural mixing. Scandinavian-style jewelry appears in Slavic graves, while Slavic-influenced metalwork shows up in Swedish archaeological sites. More importantly, DNA analysis of medieval remains from both regions shows clear evidence of genetic exchange, with Scandinavian markers appearing in Slavic populations and vice versa. But the genetic mixing was gradual and limited. The core populations on both sides remained distinct, with intermarriage and cultural exchange adding complexity without fundamentally altering the basic character of either society. A Swedish trader might marry a Slavic woman and bring her home to his farm near Uppsala, where her children would grow up speaking Old Norse and worshipping the Norse gods, carrying Slavic genes but living as Scandinavians. As our journey continues southward, the diversity of our encounters increases. At Kiev, the great city that controlled trade along the Dnieper River, we find a cosmopolitan mixture that would have seemed exotic to farmers back in rural Norway. Here, Scandinavian Rus rulers governed Slavic subjects, while Byzantine merchants traded alongside Jewish traders from the Khazar Empire, and, occasionally, Arab merchants from even more distant lands. The Rus themselves, Vikings who had settled in what is now Russia and Ukraine, represent one of the most successful examples of Viking cultural adaptation. Over the course of several generations, these Scandinavian warriors and traders had adopted Slavic customs, intermarried with local populations, and created a hybrid culture that was neither fully Viking nor fully Slavic, but something new and distinctive. Yet, even as they adapted to their new environment, the Rus maintained connections to their Scandinavian homeland. Archaeological evidence shows a continued trade and cultural exchange between the Rus territories and Scandinavia proper, with goods, ideas, and people flowing in both directions. A young man from Norway might join a Rus trading expedition, spend several years in Kiev or Novgorod, and return home with stories, wealth, and perhaps a Slavic wife. The genetic evidence from this period shows the results of this mixing. DNA analysis of medieval remains from both Scandinavia and the Rus territories reveals clear evidence of gene flow between the populations, but within limits that maintained the basic character of both groups. The Scandinavians remained predominantly Scandinavian, while the Slavs remained predominantly Slavic, but with enough mixing to add complexity and diversity to both populations. From Kiev, our trading route continues southward toward the Black Sea and the great city of Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire and one of the largest and most cosmopolitan cities in the medieval world. Here, our Viking traders would have encountered a level of ethnic and cultural diversity that would have been almost unimaginable in the rural communities of Scandinavia. Constantinople was home to Greeks and Armenians, Bulgars and Slavs, Italians and Arabs, Jews and Georgians, and dozens of other ethnic groups drawn to the city by its wealth and opportunities. The famous Varangian Guard, the elite military unit that served the Byzantine emperors, was composed largely of Scandinavians and other Northern Europeans, creating a permanent Viking presence in the heart of the Byzantine world. These Varangians represent another example of Viking adaptability and cultural mixing. While maintaining their reputation as fierce warriors, they adopted Byzantine customs, learned Greek, and often married local women. Some eventually returned to Scandinavia with Byzantine wives and stories of the great city's wonders, while others settled permanently in the empire, their descendants gradually becoming absorbed into the local population. The archaeological record from Constantinople includes numerous Scandinavian artifacts, weapons, jewelry, and personal items that speak to the presence of Vikings in the city. But more interesting are the hybrid objects that show clear influence from both cultures. Byzantine-style metalwork with Scandinavian decorative motifs, or Scandinavian-style brooches made with Byzantine techniques and materials. From Constantinople, some Viking traders continued even further south and east, following routes that led to the markets of Baghdad, Damascus, and other centers of the Islamic world. Here, they encountered peoples and cultures that were truly foreign to their northern European experience. Arabs, Persians, and others whose appearance, customs, and beliefs were radically different from anything they had known at home. The famous account of Ibn Fadlan, an Arab diplomat who encountered Vikings along the Volga River in the early 10th century, provides us with a fascinating glimpse of these cultural encounters from the other side. Ibn Fadlan describes the Vikings he met as tall, blond, and heavily tattooed, noting their customs with a mixture of fascination and horror. His account reveals not only how Vikings appeared to foreign observers, but also how exotic and strange these northern Europeans seemed to people from the Islamic world. These encounters with the Islamic world left their mark on Viking culture in numerous ways. Arabic silver coins, thousands of them, have been found in Scandinavian archaeological sites, evidence of the wealth that flowed northward along these trade routes. More subtly, Islamic artistic motifs appear in Scandinavian metalwork and wood carving, showing how Viking craftsmen adapted foreign designs to their own aesthetic traditions. But did these trading contacts result in significant numbers of Arabs or other Middle Eastern peoples settling in Scandinavia? The archaeological and genetic evidence suggests that such settlement was extremely rare. While individual traders or slaves from these distant lands might occasionally have made their way to Scandinavia, they left little lasting genetic or cultural impact on the population as a whole. The Western trade routes tell a similar story of contact, cultural exchange, and limited genetic mixing. Viking expeditions to Ireland, Scotland, and the islands of the North Atlantic brought Scandinavian raiders and settlers into contact with Celtic populations that were genetically and culturally distinct from their own. The genetic evidence from these regions shows clear signs of Scandinavian settlement and intermarriage. Modern populations in the Scottish Islands, Ireland, and Iceland all carry significant Scandinavian genetic markers, evidence of the Viking settlements that were established there during the medieval period. But the mixing went both directions. Scandinavian populations also show evidence of Celtic genetic input, suggesting that Vikings brought Celtic wives and slaves back to their homeland. The case of Iceland is particularly interesting because it represents a controlled experiment in Viking Age population mixing. The island was uninhabited when the first Norse settlers arrived in the late 9th century, and the genetic makeup of the founding population can be traced through both historical records and modern DNA analysis. Studies of modern Icelandic DNA reveal a population that is approximately 80% Scandinavian and 20% Celtic in origin, with the Celtic component coming primarily from women rather than men. This suggests that male Viking settlers brought Celtic wives and female slaves with them to the new colony, creating a population that was culturally Scandinavian but genetically mixed. The historical records support this interpretation. The Landnámabók, which chronicles the settlement of Iceland, mentions numerous settlers with Celtic names or Celtic ancestry, often described as the sons or daughters of Irish or Scottish mothers. These individuals were fully integrated into Icelandic society, their mixed heritage seen as unremarkable in a frontier community where practical skills and personal character mattered more than ethnic purity. But even in Iceland, with its significant Celtic genetic component, the culture remained fundamentally Scandinavian. The language, laws, religious practices, and social organization were all derived from Norway and other Scandinavian regions. The Celtic genetic input added diversity to the population without fundamentally altering its cultural character. The North Atlantic expeditions also brought Vikings into contact with peoples who were truly foreign to their European experience. In Greenland, they encountered the Thule people, ancestors of the modern Inuit, whose appearance and culture were unlike anything in the European world. In North America, they met various Native American groups whom they called Skraelings. These encounters were brief and often hostile, but they left their mark on both sides. Archaeological evidence from Greenland and Newfoundland shows clear signs of contact between Vikings and indigenous peoples, including trade goods that moved between the communities. Genetic studies of modern Inuit populations have even identified possible traces of European ancestry that might date to the Viking period, though this remains controversial and difficult to prove definitively. More certain is the reverse flow, the presence of Native American genetic markers in modern Icelandic populations. Recent studies have identified a specific genetic lineage, known as C1e, that appears to have been brought to Iceland by Vikings returning from their North American expeditions. This lineage, found today in a small number of Icelandic families, represents direct genetic evidence of contact between Vikings and Native Americans more than 1,000 years ago. These far-flung trading and raiding expeditions created a network of cultural and genetic exchange that spanned much of the known world. But it's important to understand the scale and nature of this exchange. While Vikings traveled widely and encountered diverse peoples, the genetic and cultural impact of these encounters on Scandinavian society was limited and gradual. The core population of Scandinavia remained predominantly Scandinavian throughout the Viking Age and beyond. The mixing that occurred was real but modest, adding complexity and diversity without fundamentally altering the basic character of the society. A typical Viking community might include individuals with Celtic, Slavic, or other foreign ancestry, but these would be exceptions rather than the rule, notable precisely because of their rarity. This pattern of limited but significant mixing is exactly what we would expect from a society that was simultaneously insular and cosmopolitan. The Vikings were great travelers and traders, open to new ideas and opportunities, but they were also deeply rooted in their own cultural traditions and social structures. They adopted what was useful from other cultures while maintaining their own distinctive identity. The trading networks also facilitated the spread of ideas, technologies, and artistic styles that enriched Viking culture without changing its fundamental character. Scandinavian metalworkers learned new techniques from Byzantine craftsmen, but used them to create distinctively Scandinavian objects. Viking poets incorporated new stories and motifs from their travels, but wove them into traditional Scandinavian narrative forms. Perhaps most importantly, these trading contacts created a worldview that was both confident and curious. Vikings saw themselves as part of a larger world, connected to distant lands and peoples through networks of trade and cultural exchange. This cosmopolitan outlook made them adaptable and innovative, able to thrive in environments as different as the Irish monasteries they raided, and the Byzantine courts where they served as guards. As our trading journey draws to a close and we turn our longship homeward, laden with silver and silk, spices and stories, we can see how these ancient trade routes shaped Viking society. They created a people who were simultaneously rooted in their northern homeland and connected to the wider world, who maintained their distinctive cultural identity while remaining open to foreign influences and opportunities. The genetic and cultural diversity that resulted from these contacts was real and significant, but it operated within limits that preserved the essential character of Scandinavian society. The Vikings, who returned from these trading expeditions, brought with them new blood, new ideas, and new perspectives. But they remained recognizably Viking in their outlook and identity. On river currents and sea winds, cultures touched and parted, leaving traces that we can still detect in the DNA of modern populations and in the archaeological record of medieval Scandinavia. But these traces tell a story of gradual mixing and cultural exchange, rather than dramatic demographic change, of a society that was enriched by contact with the wider world without losing its own distinctive character. The mist lifts from the river as we near home, revealing the familiar landscape of fjords and forests that shaped the Viking worldview. In the distance, smoke rises from longhouse chimneys, marking the communities where the wealth and knowledge gained from these trading expeditions will be shared and integrated into the ongoing story of Scandinavian civilization. This is the true story of Viking diversity. Not the simple narrative of racial mixing that some modern interpreters prefer, but the complex reality of a society that was simultaneously local and global, traditional and innovative, homogeneous and diverse. It's a story written in silver coins and genetic markers, in archaeological artifacts and historical records, in the very landscape of Northern Europe itself. Myths of diversity. The laboratory is quiet except for the gentle hum of equipment, a stark contrast to the wind-swept burial mounds where the bones we're examining were first laid to rest over 1,000 years ago. Here, in this temple of modern science, ancient DNA tells stories that no saga ever recorded, revealing truths about Viking ancestry that would have been impossible to discover through historical sources alone. Dr. Eske Willerslev carefully handles a small fragment of bone, extracted from a grave in Denmark that dates to the height of the Viking Age. This tiny piece of calcium and collagen contains within it a genetic library that can tell us not just about the individual who died so long ago, but about the entire population structure of medieval Scandinavia. It's a story written in the four-letter alphabet of DNA, preserved in the cold earth for a millennium, waiting for the technology to read it. The results, when they come, paint a picture that is both more complex and more straightforward than the heated debates about Viking diversity might suggest. Yes, there was mixing. Yes, there was contact with distant peoples. Yes, the genetic landscape of Viking Age Scandinavia was more diverse than a simple stereotype might suggest. But the nature and extent of that diversity tells a very different story from the one being promoted in some modern narratives. Let me take you through the evidence, piece by piece, as it has emerged from laboratories across Europe and North America over the past 2 decades. This is the story of what ancient DNA actually tells us about Viking ancestry, stripped of political interpretation and modern wishful thinking, presented as clearly as the scientific method allows. The first major breakthrough came in 2020, when an international team of researchers published the results of the largest genetic study of Viking Age remains ever conducted. They analyzed DNA from 442 individuals buried across Europe during the Viking Age, from Greenland in the west to Poland in the east, from Norway in the north to Italy in the south. The scope was unprecedented, the methodology rigorous, the results illuminating. What they found was a population that was indeed genetically diverse, but diverse in ways that reflected the actual historical patterns of Viking expansion and contact, rather than modern assumptions about racial mixing. The core Scandinavian population showed the genetic signatures we would expect. Predominantly Northern European ancestry, with clear connections to other Germanic populations and to the broader family of European peoples. But within this broad pattern, there were fascinating variations that told the story of Viking Age mobility and cultural exchange. Individuals buried in Norway showed genetic connections not just to other Scandinavians, but to populations in the British Isles, reflecting the extensive Viking activity in Ireland, Scotland, and northern England. Swedish graves contained individuals with genetic markers suggesting Eastern European ancestry, consistent with the extensive Viking involvement in the trade routes through Russia and Ukraine. Most intriguingly, the study found that Viking Age Scandinavia was more genetically diverse than modern Scandinavia, suggesting that the population mixing of the medieval period was followed by a gradual homogenization over the subsequent centuries. This pattern makes perfect sense when we consider the historical context. The Viking Age was a period of unprecedented mobility and contact, followed by centuries of more settled, localized existence. But what about the specific claims that have generated so much controversy? What about the suggestion that Vikings were predominantly black, or that significant numbers of sub-Saharan Africans sailed on the longships? Here, the genetic evidence is unambiguous and decisive. Of the 442 individuals analyzed in the major 2020 study, not a single one showed genetic markers consistent with sub-Saharan African ancestry. Not one. This doesn't mean that no individual of African descent ever set foot in Viking Age Scandinavia. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, as archaeologists like to say. But it does mean that if such individuals existed, they were so rare as to leave no detectable trace in the genetic record of the population as a whole. The same pattern holds for other genetic studies of Viking Age remains. A 2019 analysis of DNA from Viking Age graves in the Orkney Islands found a population that was genetically mixed between Scandinavian and Celtic ancestry. Exactly what we would expect from the historical record of Viking settlement in Scotland. A 2018 study of remains from Iceland confirmed the pattern suggested by historical sources. A population that was roughly 80% Scandinavian and 20% Celtic in origin. These studies consistently show the same pattern. Viking Age populations were genetically diverse, but the diversity reflected contact and mixing with neighboring European populations, rather than with distant African or Asian peoples. The genetic landscape of Viking Scandinavia was shaped by the same historical processes that we can trace through archaeology and written sources. Trade with Slavic peoples to the east, settlement and intermarriage in Celtic lands to the west, and occasional long-distance contacts that left little lasting genetic impact. But genetic evidence is just one piece of the puzzle. To understand the full picture of Viking diversity, we need to combine DNA analysis with archaeological evidence, historical sources, and careful analysis of the physical remains themselves. When we do this, the picture becomes even clearer. Osteological analysis, the study of bones and skeletal remains, provides another window into Viking Age populations. Measurements of skull shape, bone density, and other physical characteristics can tell us about the ancestry and appearance of individuals in ways that complement genetic analysis. These studies consistently show that Viking Age Scandinavians had the physical characteristics we would expect from Northern European populations. Robust builds, relatively tall stature, and cranial features consistent with Germanic ancestry. Occasionally, archaeologists do find individuals whose skeletal characteristics suggest different ancestry, A grave in Sweden might contain someone whose bone structure suggests Celtic origins, or a burial in Denmark might include an individual whose features point to Slavic ancestry. But these cases are notable precisely because they are exceptions to the general pattern, and they usually can be explained by the historical processes we know were occurring: intermarriage with Celtic populations, trade relationships with Slavic peoples, or the incorporation of foreign slaves into Scandinavian society. The isotope analysis of teeth provides yet another line of evidence about Viking Age populations. Different regions have different isotopic signatures in their water and soil, and these signatures are incorporated into the teeth of people who grow up in those regions. By analyzing the isotopic composition of Viking Age teeth, researchers can determine where individuals spent their childhood, even if they were buried far from their birthplace. These studies reveal a population that was indeed mobile, with significant numbers of individuals buried far from where they were born. But the mobility patterns revealed by isotope analysis match what we know from historical sources about Viking Age migration and settlement. People moved from Norway to Iceland, from Denmark to England, from Sweden to the Baltic regions. The movement was primarily within the broader Scandinavian and Northern European world, with occasional individuals who had traveled from more distant regions. One of the most comprehensive isotope studies, published in 2019, analyzed teeth from over 300 Viking Age individuals buried across Scandinavia. The results showed that about 20% of the individuals had spent their childhood in regions different from where they were buried, confirming the high mobility of Viking Age populations. But the vast majority of these mobile individuals had moved within Scandinavia, or between Scandinavia and neighboring regions like the British Isles or the Baltic. The few individuals who showed isotopic signatures consistent with more distant origins, perhaps the Mediterranean or the Middle East, were so rare as to be statistically insignificant. They represent interesting individual stories, perhaps traders or slaves who had traveled vast distances. But they don't change the overall picture of a population that was predominantly Northern European in origin. Archaeological evidence from Viking Age settlements tells a similar story. Excavations across Scandinavia have uncovered thousands of graves, house foundations, and artifact assemblages that provide detailed information about how these people lived and what they looked like. The material culture is overwhelmingly Scandinavian in character, with foreign influences appearing as additions to rather than replacements for local traditions. The famous ship burials at Oseberg and Gokstad in Norway, for example, contain artifacts that show clear evidence of contact with the wider world. Silk from China, silver from the Islamic world, amber from the Baltic. But the overall assemblage is distinctively Scandinavian, reflecting a culture that was confident in its own identity while remaining open to foreign influences. The human remains from these sites tell the same story. The individuals buried in these elaborate graves had the physical characteristics we would expect from Scandinavian aristocrats: tall, robust, and clearly well-nourished. Their grave goods suggest lives of wealth and power, but also lives lived within recognizably Scandinavian cultural frameworks. But what about the artistic representations of Vikings from their own time? What do contemporary images tell us about how these people saw themselves and others? Here, the evidence is somewhat limited, as the Vikings were not great producers of representational art, but what exists is consistent with the other lines of evidence. The Gotland picture stones, carved memorial stones from the Swedish island of Gotland, include numerous depictions of human figures that are clearly meant to represent Vikings. These figures are shown with the clothing, weapons, and hairstyles that we associate with Scandinavian culture, and their physical features, while stylized, are consistent with Northern European appearance. Similarly, the few manuscript illuminations that show Vikings, mostly created by their enemies or neighbors, depict them as fair-skinned Northern Europeans. The famous illustration of Vikings in the Harley Psalter, created in Canterbury in the early 11th century, shows them as bearded, fair-haired warriors. Exactly what we would expect from the other evidence. The absence of any contemporary depictions of Black Vikings is particularly significant, given that medieval artists were quite capable of depicting people of different ethnicities when they encountered them. Byzantine art, for example, includes clear depictions of Africans, Arabs, and other non-European peoples. If significant numbers of Black Africans had been present in Viking society, we would expect to find some trace of this in the artistic record. The written sources from the Viking Age and its immediate aftermath also support the picture painted by genetic and archaeological evidence. The sagas, chronicles, and other texts describe Vikings as fair-skinned northerners, occasionally noting individuals with unusual features, but treating these as exceptions rather than the norm. When the sources do describe encounters with people of different ethnicities, they are quite explicit about it. The sagas mention Irish slaves, Slavic traders, and Byzantine merchants, clearly identifying these individuals as foreign. If significant numbers of Africans had been present in Viking society, we would expect similar explicit mentions in the written record. The absence of such mentions is particularly telling, given that medieval Scandinavians were quite aware of the existence of African peoples. They traded with the Islamic world, where they would have encountered people of various ethnicities, and their geographical knowledge extended to Africa, which they called Blaland, the land of black people. They had the vocabulary and the conceptual framework to describe African peoples, but they didn't use it to describe themselves or their immediate neighbors. So where do the modern claims about Black Vikings come from? The answer lies not in the historical evidence, but in the intersection of contemporary politics, social media, and artificial intelligence. The images of Black Vikings that circulate online are almost invariably AI-generated, created by algorithms that have been trained on modern assumptions about diversity rather than historical evidence. These AI systems, when prompted to create images of diverse Vikings, produce pictures that reflect contemporary American ideas about racial representation, rather than medieval Scandinavian reality. The algorithms have no understanding of historical context or archaeological evidence. They simply combine visual elements in ways that match their training data and the prompts they receive. The spread of these images on social media has been facilitated by well-meaning people who want to promote diversity and inclusion, but who may not be familiar with the actual historical evidence about Viking populations. The images are shared and reshared, often without any indication that they are AI-generated, rather than historically accurate, gradually creating a false impression of what Vikings actually looked like. This process is particularly insidious because it operates through the same mechanisms that spread accurate historical information. A genuine archaeological discovery about Viking DNA might be shared alongside an AI-generated image of Black Vikings, with both receiving similar levels of engagement and credibility from social media users who lack the expertise to distinguish between them. The result is a growing disconnect between what the evidence actually shows about Viking populations and what many people believe to be true. This disconnect is not harmless. It distorts our understanding of the past and undermines the careful work of archaeologists, geneticists, and historians who have spent decades uncovering the real story of Viking diversity. The real story, as revealed by the convergent evidence of genetics, archaeology, and historical sources, is both more complex and more straightforward than the simplified narratives that dominate social media. Vikings were indeed diverse, but their diversity reflected the actual historical processes of their time and place, rather than modern political ideals about representation. They were diverse in the way that any mobile, trading society would be diverse, through contact and intermarriage with neighboring populations, through the incorporation of slaves and traders from distant lands, through the gradual mixing that occurs when cultures meet and interact. But this diversity operated within limits that maintained the basic character of Scandinavian society, and left clear traces in the genetic and archaeological record. The evidence shows us a people who were predominantly Northern European in ancestry, but enriched by contact with the wider world. They were tall, robust, and fair-skinned, but with enough individual variation to make nicknames based on appearance both common and meaningful. They were culturally confident but intellectually curious, maintaining their own traditions while adopting useful innovations from other societies. Most importantly, they were real people who lived in a real historical context, not symbols or representatives of modern political positions. To understand them properly, we must see them as they actually were, rather than as we might wish them to have been. The evidence, carefully gathered and rigorously analyzed, gives us that opportunity if we have the courage to accept what it tells us. As we leave the laboratory and return to the wind-swept burial mounds where this ancient DNA was first laid to rest, we carry with us a clearer picture of who the Vikings actually were. It's a picture that honors both their genuine diversity and their distinctive identity, that recognizes both their connections to the wider world and their roots in the soil of Scandinavia. Difference was present, but never the whole. And in that nuanced truth lies a story more interesting and more human than any simplified narrative could provide. Misuse of history. The glow of the computer screen illuminates a face bent in concentration, fingers dancing across a keyboard as another AI-generated image takes shape. Within moments, a picture emerges that would have astounded anyone from the Viking Age. A dark-skinned warrior in Norse armor, standing proudly beside a longship, his features bearing no resemblance to the archaeological record of medieval Scandinavia, but perfectly matching contemporary ideas about diversity and representation. With a few clicks, this image joins thousands of others flooding social media platforms, each one accompanied by captions claiming to reveal the hidden truth about Viking diversity, each one shared by well-meaning people who believe they are correcting historical injustices. Within hours, the image has been viewed by millions, liked by thousands, and incorporated into the growing mythology that surrounds the Vikings in our digital age. This is how history dies in the 21st century. Not through the dramatic destruction of libraries or the burning of books, but through the quiet accumulation of false images and misleading narratives that gradually replace authentic knowledge with politically convenient fiction. It's a process that would have been impossible in earlier eras, when the creation and distribution of images required significant resources and expertise, but which has become trivially easy in our age of artificial intelligence and social media. The Vikings have become a particular target of this historical revisionism, their image reshaped to serve contemporary political purposes in ways that would have been unimaginable to the people who actually lived in medieval Scandinavia. But to understand why this matters, we need to step back from the immediate controversy. and consider the broader question of how and why societies manipulate their understanding of the past. History has always been political. Every society tells stories about its origins that serve to legitimize its present arrangements and future aspirations. The Vikings themselves did this, creating sagas that portrayed their ancestors as heroes and their enemies as villains, shaping the past to serve the needs of the present. Medieval chroniclers did it, Christian writers did it, nationalist historians of the 19th century did it with particular enthusiasm. But there's a crucial difference between interpreting the past through the lens of present concerns and actively falsifying the historical record. Previous generations of historians might have emphasized certain aspects of Viking history while downplaying others, but they generally worked within the constraints imposed by available evidence. They might have been selective in their use of sources, but they didn't simply invent sources that never existed. What we're seeing today represents something qualitatively different: the creation of entirely fictional historical narratives supported by fabricated visual evidence. The AI-generated images of Black Vikings aren't interpretations of ambiguous historical data. They're pure inventions that contradict everything we know about medieval Scandinavian populations. They represent a new form of historical falsification that would have been impossible before the development of sophisticated image generation technology. The process typically begins with a kernel of legitimate historical complexity. Yes, Vikings did travel widely and encounter diverse peoples. Yes, their society did incorporate individuals from various backgrounds. Yes, the genetic record shows evidence of mixing with neighboring populations. These facts provide a foundation of plausibility that makes the subsequent distortions seem reasonable to people who aren't familiar with the details of the archaeological and genetic evidence. But from this foundation of legitimate complexity, the narrative quickly moves into pure fantasy. The occasional Celtic slave or Slavic trader becomes evidence of widespread racial diversity. The rare individual with unusual features becomes representative of the entire population. The gradual genetic mixing that occurred over centuries becomes transformed into a picture of Vikings as a predominantly non-European people. The AI-generated images that accompany these narratives serve a crucial function in this process of historical falsification. Humans are visual creatures. We process images faster and more intuitively than text, and we tend to remember visual information more vividly than written descriptions. A single compelling image can override hours of careful historical explanation, creating an impression that persists long after the specific details have been forgotten. The creators of these images understand this psychological reality and exploit it ruthlessly. They know that most people won't check the sources behind a striking historical image, won't investigate whether it's based on archaeological evidence or AI generation. They know that the emotional impact of seeing diverse Vikings will override the intellectual process of evaluating historical claims. The technology that makes this possible is both remarkable and terrifying in its implications. Modern AI systems can generate images that are virtually indistinguishable from photographs, creating visual evidence for historical claims that have no basis in reality. They can produce hundreds or thousands of such images in a matter of hours, flooding social media platforms with content that appears to document historical realities that never existed. The algorithms that power these systems have been trained on vast datasets of images and text, absorbing not just factual information, but also the biases and assumptions of their creators. When prompted to create diverse historical images, They tend to apply contemporary American concepts of diversity rather than historically accurate representations of past populations. The result is a systematic distortion of the historical record that reflects present-day political priorities rather than past realities. But the technology is only part of the problem. The deeper issue lies in the motivations and assumptions of the people who create and share these fabricated historical narratives. Many of them are genuinely well-intentioned, believing that they are correcting historical injustices or revealing truths that have been suppressed by biased historians. They see themselves as fighting against racism and promoting inclusion, noble goals that make it difficult to criticize their methods. The problem is that good intentions don't automatically lead to good history. The desire to create a more inclusive narrative about the past can lead to the same kinds of distortions that characterized earlier forms of historical bias, just in the opposite direction. Instead of erasing the contributions of marginalized groups, the new revisionism erases the actual historical experiences of the people it claims to represent. Consider what's lost when we replace the real Vikings with AI-generated fantasies. We lose the opportunity to understand how medieval Scandinavians actually lived, how they understood themselves and their world, how they navigated the challenges of their time and place. We lose the chance to learn from their genuine achievements and failures, their real struggles with questions of identity and belonging. We also lose the opportunity to understand the actual patterns of cultural contact and exchange that characterized the Viking Age. The real story of how Scandinavians interacted with Celtic, Slavic, and other European peoples is fascinating and instructive, full of lessons about how cultures adapt and change through contact with others. But this real story gets buried under layers of fantasy that serve a contemporary political purposes, rather than historical understanding. Perhaps most importantly, we lose the ability to think critically about the past and its relationship to the present. When history becomes a tool for advancing contemporary political agendas, it ceases to function as a source of genuine knowledge and wisdom. Instead of helping us understand the complexity of human experience across time and cultures, it becomes just another battlefield in contemporary culture wars. The Vikings have become a particular target of this historical manipulation because they occupy such a prominent place in popular culture, and because their image has been associated with various forms of modern identity politics. For some, they represent an idealized vision of European warrior culture that serves nationalist or white supremacist agendas. For others, they represent an opportunity to challenge these associations by reimagining Vikings as a diverse, multicultural society. Both of these approaches treat the Vikings as symbols rather than as real people who lived in a specific historical context. Both subordinate historical truth to contemporary political purposes. Both contribute to the erosion of genuine historical understanding in favor of simplified narratives that serve present-day ideological needs. The consequences of this historical manipulation extend far beyond academic debates about medieval Scandinavia. When we lose the ability to distinguish between evidence-based history and politically motivated fantasy, we undermine the foundations of rational discourse in democratic society. If the past can be reimagined at will to serve contemporary purposes, then the concept of objective truth itself becomes meaningless. This is particularly dangerous in an era when authoritarian movements around the world are using historical revisionism as a tool for political mobilization. The techniques being used to create fake images of diverse Vikings are the same ones being used to deny genocides, fabricate national mythologies, and justify contemporary political violence. The normalization of historical falsification in service of seemingly benign goals like promoting diversity makes it easier for malicious actors to use the same techniques for more sinister purposes. The academic community bears some responsibility for this situation. Too many historians and archaeologists have been reluctant to speak out against obvious historical falsifications, either because they sympathize with the political goals of the revisionists or because they fear being labeled as racist or exclusionary. This silence has allowed false narratives to spread unchallenged, gradually displacing accurate historical knowledge in the public consciousness. The solution is not to retreat into ivory tower isolation, but to engage more actively in public education about the past. Historians and archaeologists need to find ways to communicate their findings that are both accurate and engaging, that acknowledge the complexity of historical evidence while resisting the temptation to oversimplify for political purposes. This means being honest about what we know and what we don't know about Viking Age populations. It means acknowledging that Vikings were indeed diverse in some ways, while being clear about the nature and limits of that diversity. It means presenting the evidence for genetic mixing and cultural exchange without exaggerating its significance or misrepresenting its character. Most importantly, it means defending the principle that historical claims should be based on evidence rather than political preferences. This doesn't mean that history is politically neutral. All historical interpretation involves choices about what to emphasize and how to frame the evidence. But it does mean that there are limits to legitimate interpretation, boundaries beyond which we move from history into fiction. The Vikings themselves understood the importance of preserving accurate memories of the past. Their sagas, for all their literary embellishments, were attempts to maintain connections to ancestral traditions and historical experiences. They understood that a society that loses touch with its real past becomes vulnerable to manipulation and deception. We would do well to learn from their example. In an age of artificial intelligence and social media manipulation, the need for rigorous, evidence-based historical scholarship has never been greater. The past is not a playground for contemporary political fantasies, but a repository of human experience that can teach us valuable lessons about the complexity of cultural identity and social change. The real Vikings, the farmers and traders, warriors and craftsmen who lived in medieval Scandinavia, deserve better than to be turned into symbols for contemporary political movements. They deserve to be understood on their own terms, in their own historical context, as real people who faced real challenges and made real choices within the constraints of their time and place. Their story, properly told, is more interesting and more instructive than any politically motivated fantasy could be. It's a story of cultural adaptation and innovation, of the complex ways that societies maintain their identity while remaining open to change. It's a story that can teach us valuable lessons about diversity and inclusion, but only if we're willing to listen to what the evidence actually tells us, rather than what we might prefer to hear. The mist of falsification that surrounds the Vikings today will eventually clear, as all historical myths eventually do. But the damage done in the meantime, to historical understanding, to public discourse, to the very concept of truth itself, may take generations to repair. The time to act is now, while we still have the ability to distinguish between evidence and fantasy, between history and propaganda. Truth rests in the earth, not in slogans, and it's our responsibility to dig it up and preserve it for future generations who will judge us by how well we maintained our commitment to honest inquiry in the face of political pressure and technological manipulation. The Eternal Return. The fjord lies still in the gathering dusk, its dark waters reflecting the first stars that appear in the northern sky. The longships that once carried Vikings to distant shores have long since returned to the earth, their dragon heads silent, their sails furled forever. But something of their presence lingers here, in the whisper of wind through pine branches, in the lap of waves against ancient stones, in the very landscape that shaped the people we have come to know through our journey together. We have traveled far in these pages, you and I. We have walked through smoky longhouses and sailed on trading rivers, examined ancient bones in modern laboratories, and listened to the voices of skalds telling stories by firelight. We have tried to see the Vikings as they actually were, not as symbols or representatives of modern political positions, but as real people who lived and loved and died in a world very different from our own. What have we learned from this journey? What truths have emerged from the mist of mythology and misunderstanding that surrounds these remarkable people? First, we have learned that the Vikings were indeed diverse, but diverse in ways that reflected their actual historical experience rather than our contemporary ideas about representation. They were a people shaped by the gradual mixing of Scandinavian, Celtic, Slavic, and Finnic populations, by marriages that crossed tribal boundaries, by trade relationships that spanned continents. Their diversity was real and significant, but it was the diversity of medieval Europe rather than the diversity of modern America. We have seen how genetic evidence, archaeological discoveries, and historical sources all tell the same story, of a population that was predominantly Northern European in ancestry, but enriched by contact with neighboring peoples. The DNA extracted from their graves speaks of journeys to Ireland and Scotland, of trade with Slavic peoples, of the slow interweaving of bloodlines that occurs when cultures meet at the edges of the known world. But it also speaks of limits, of a core identity that remained recognizably Scandinavian, even as it incorporated influences from distant lands. We have learned that names carry stories, but not always the stories that modern interpreters want to hear. Halfdan the Black earned his nickname not because he represented some hidden African presence in medieval Norway, but because his dark hair made him memorable in a world where such features were uncommon. Geirmund Heljarskin bore a name that reflected his unusual appearance in a society that noticed and remembered individual distinctions. But his story is one of Scandinavian Finnic mixing, rather than African ancestry. The sagas that preserve these names reveal a people who were keenly observant of physical differences, but who understood identity in terms of kinship, loyalty, and cultural belonging, rather than racial categories. They were a society that could absorb foreign influences while maintaining its distinctive character, that could welcome strangers while preserving its own traditions. We have sailed with Viking traders on the great rivers that connected Scandinavia to the wider world, feeling the spray of cold water and hearing the creak of wooden hulls as we followed routes that stretched from the icebound shores of Greenland to the golden markets of Constantinople. We have seen how these trading networks created opportunities for cultural exchange and genetic mixing, but within limits that preserved the essential character of Scandinavian society. The silver coins and silk fabrics that flowed northward along these routes tell stories of contact and exchange, but they also tell stories of cultural confidence and selective adoption. The Vikings took what was useful from other cultures while maintaining their own distinctive identity, creating a society that was simultaneously cosmopolitan and traditional, open to the world yet rooted in its own soil. We have examined the modern myths that have grown up around Viking diversity, tracing their origins to the intersection of well-meaning political intentions and powerful new technologies. We have seen how artificial intelligence can create images that appear to document historical realities that never existed. How social media can spread false narratives faster than scholars can correct them. How the desire to promote contemporary values can lead to the distortion of historical truth. But we have also seen the danger in these distortions. The way they rob us of the opportunity to learn from the real experiences of real people who faced their own challenges in their own time. When we replace the actual Vikings with politically convenient fantasies, we lose the chance to understand how medieval societies actually navigated questions of identity and belonging, how they maintained cohesion while remaining open to change. Most importantly, we have learned that the truth about the Vikings is more beautiful and more complex than any simplified narrative could capture. They were neither the pure Nordic archetypes of some fantasies, nor the diverse, multicultural society of others. They were something more interesting and more human. A people shaped by their environment and their history, carrying within themselves the genetic and cultural heritage of Northern Europe, touched by contact with distant lands, but rooted firmly in the soil of Scandinavia. Their story teaches us valuable lessons about the nature of cultural identity and social change. It shows us how societies can maintain their distinctive character while remaining open to foreign influences, how they can preserve their traditions while adapting to new circumstances, how they can be both local and global, both traditional and innovative. These lessons are particularly relevant in our own time, when questions of identity and belonging seem to dominate public discourse, when the relationship between diversity and unity remains contentious and unresolved. The Vikings offer us a model of how these tensions can be navigated, not through the denial of difference or the abandonment of tradition, but through the gradual, organic process of cultural adaptation and integration. But their story also warns us about the dangers of using the past to serve present political purposes. When we distort history to fit contemporary agendas, we lose something irreplaceable: the actual human experiences that can teach us how to live better in our own time. The Vikings deserve to be understood on their own terms, in their own historical context, as real people who made real choices within the constraints of their world. As we prepare to leave this place, to return from the fjords of medieval Scandinavia to the complexities of our modern world, let us carry with us not simplified slogans or convenient myths, but the complex truth about these remarkable people. Let us remember them not as symbols or representatives, but as individuals who lived fully in their own time, who faced their challenges with courage and creativity, who left behind a legacy that continues to inspire and instruct us today. The longhouses are empty now, their fires long cold, their voices silent, but something of their spirit remains in the landscape that shaped them, in the genetic heritage of their descendants, in the stories that have survived the centuries to reach us across the gulf of time. They speak to us still, these men and women of the North, if we have the wisdom to listen to what they actually have to say, rather than what we might prefer to hear. In the end, the Vikings were many things: farmers and warriors, traders and craftsmen, poets and storytellers, mothers and fathers who loved their children and mourned their dead. They were capable of great cruelty and great beauty, of fierce loyalty and bitter betrayal, of remarkable courage and ordinary human weakness. They were, above all, fully human, complex, contradictory, and bound to their time and place in ways that make them both foreign and familiar to us today. Their diversity was real but limited. their achievements remarkable but rooted in their specific historical context, their legacy enduring but often misunderstood. They were not perfect people or ideal representatives of any modern political position. They were simply human beings who lived as fully as they could within the constraints of their world, who left behind traces of their existence that we can still detect in the earth and in the genes of their descendants. The stars that shine down on the fjord tonight are the same stars that illuminated their longships as they sailed to distant shores, that guided them home to the familiar landscapes of their birth. In their light, we can see the continuity that connects us to these ancient people, the shared humanity that transcends the boundaries of time and culture. The Vikings were not black or white in the way we understand those categories today. They were not diverse or homogeneous in the way our political debates might suggest. They were something more complex and more interesting. They were human in all the messy, contradictory, beautiful complexity that humanity entails. That is their gift to us. Not a simple answer to our contemporary questions about race and identity, but a reminder of the complexity of human experience, the importance of understanding the past on its own terms, and the danger of using history to serve political purposes, rather than to expand our understanding of what it means to be human. The fjord grows dark as the last light fades from the western sky. The wind carries with it the scent of pine and salt water, the eternal perfumes of this northern land. Somewhere in the distance, a night bird calls, its voice echoing across the water like the ghost of ancient songs. The Vikings sleep now in the earth that gave them birth, their stories preserved in saga and stone, in bone and DNA, in the very landscape that shaped their souls. They have given us their truth, complex and nuanced and fully human. It remains for us to treasure it, to protect it from those who would distort it for their own purposes, and to pass it on to future generations who will judge us by how well we maintained our commitment to honest inquiry in the face of political pressure and technological manipulation. The Vikings were many things, but above all, they were human, complex, flawed, and bound to their time. In that humanity lies their greatest gift to us, and our greatest responsibility to them.